All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to be talking about a really important but sometimes kind of overlooked part of any data analyst's toolkit, non-parametric tests. We're going to make them make sense.
You know the feeling, right? You've collected your data, you're looking at the numbers, and you see something. A pattern, a connection, maybe a difference between two groups. But here's the million-dollar question. Is that pattern for real, or is it just a fluke, just random noise? Figuring that out is exactly what statistical tests are for. And pretty much every single statistical test starts from the exact same place, what we call the null hypothesis. Honestly, you can think of it as the ultimate skeptic. It's the default assumption that says, nope, nothing's going on here. No difference, no relationship. The whole job of a statistical test is to see just how much evidence our data can pile up to fight back against that skeptical starting point. Now, when most of us first learn about statistics, we usually start with this big family of tests called parametric tests. These are the absolute workhorses of data analysis. They're powerful, they're everywhere, but they can be a little bit picky about the kind of data they're willing to work with. See, these parametric tests have a pretty strict set of rules. They basically assume that your data follows that nice classic bell curve shape. They assume that the amount of variation or the spread of scores is roughly the same between the different groups you're comparing. And they're really built for quantitative data, numbers that have a consistent meaning. Your classic t-tests, Pearson's correlation, yep, they all belong to this demanding little family.
So what happens when your data just doesn't feel like playing by the rules? What if it's skewed all to one side, or it's just ranked data, or it's just messy? Well, that's where our solution comes in.
This exact situation, when your data decides to rebel against all those strict assumptions, is precisely why we have non-parametric tests. They are the flexible toolkit you need for the job. And the core difference between these two families is actually pretty simple. Parametric tests, they work directly with your raw scores, and they tend to focus on the average, or the mean. Non-parametric tests, on the other hand, do something really clever. They convert all your scores into ranks first. This is why you'll hear them called distribution-free. They don't care about a perfect bell curve. Now, the trade-off is they can be a bit more cautious, but they are so much safer to use when your data is acting up. So when do you actually reach for these tools? Well, you should definitely go non-parametric if your data is clearly skewed or just looks weird, or if what you're measuring is ordinal data to begin with. Think about finishing places in a race, first, second, third. They're also a fantastic way to double-check a result if a parametric test feels a little shaky, and they're a lifesaver when you've got a few extreme outliers that could totally throw off the mean. Okay, theory's great, but let's get practical. Let's look at 3 super common situations, and I'll show you the non-parametric swap you can use for the standard test. First up, you want to measure the relationship, or the correlation between 2 different variables. Your usual go-to parametric test is Pearson's R. But if your data is breaking the rules, your alternative is Spearman's Rho. The logic behind this one is so simple and elegant, I love it. Instead of using the raw numbers for, say, a person's age and their optimism score, you just rank them. So the youngest person gets rank 1 for age, the next youngest gets rank 2, and so on. Then you do the exact same thing for the optimism scores. And then you just run a standard correlation on those 2 new lists of ranks. It's that simple. It tells you if people who rank high on one thing also tend to rank high or low on the other. So when is this especially clutch? Well, a key rule for Pearson's correlation is that the spread of your data points has to be consistent. If you make a scatter plot and it looks more like a cone or a fan shape, narrow at one end and spreading out at the other, Pearson's can get really unreliable. But Spearman's, because it's just looking at the ranks, it is not bothered by that changing spread at all. It's a much safer bet. Okay, next tool in our kit. What if you want to compare 2 totally separate, independent groups? Think like an experimental group versus a control group. The standard parametric tool for this is the independent t-test. Its non-parametric swap is the Mann-Whitney U-test. So how does this one work? It's pretty clever. First, you just take all the scores from both of your groups and dump them into one big list. Then you rank every single one of those scores from the lowest to the highest, ignoring which group they came from. Then it goes back and adds up all the ranks for Group A and all the ranks for Group B. See, if one group is truly different, its ranks should all be clustered together, giving it a very different total rank sum than the other group. So a perfect real-world example would be if you're testing two different training programs. But let's say the final skill test scores are really skewed. Instead of using a risky t-test, the Mann-Whitney U-test can reliably tell you if one of those programs led to a significantly different distribution of ranks. It's perfect for that. And our final tool today is for when you're comparing two related scores. This is usually the same people measured at two different times, that classic before and after scenario. The parametric choice here is the paired samples t-test, and the non-parametric alternative, that's the Wilcoxon signed ranks test. This test is all about the change. First, for each person, it calculates the difference between their before and after score. Then, it ranks the size of those changes. A huge change gets a high rank, a tiny change gets a low one. But then, and this is the really cool part, it puts the original plus or minus sign back onto each rank. Finally, it just adds up all the positive ranks and all the negative ranks and sees which side is bigger. You can probably already picture a perfect use for this, right? Let's say you measure everyone's stress levels before and after they go on a vacation. The Wilcoxon test is the ideal tool here to figure out if there was a statistically significant change in those stress scores, because it looks at both how much people's stress changed and in which direction, up or down. So we've looked at all these tools. What's the big picture here? What's the final takeaway? It really all comes down to a super simple but really powerful philosophy. Think first, test later. The main message, the one thing I really want you to remember, is this. Don't just blindly fire up the default test because it's the one you know. Your first step should always be to just look at your data, plot it out, get a feel for its shape, its personality, its quirks. Only then can you make a really smart choice about which statistical tool is the right one for that specific job. You know, making this choice isn't just some fussy technical detail nobody cares about. It's actually a sign of a really thoughtful analyst. It shows that you're not trying to force your data to fit your favorite method, but instead you're adapting your method to fit the reality of your data. You're listening to it.
And really, that's what it all boils down to. By reframing the whole process, you stop asking the mechanical question, which button do I click? And you start asking a much more powerful and insightful one. What story is my data trying to tell me, and how can I choose the right tool to help it speak as clearly as possible?